So the renal tubule, the last portion of the renal tubule is called the connecting duct. So collecting duct received the filtrate from the distal convoluted tubules of several nephrons, and it just passes it on to the renal pelvis. So the way the urine flows or the filtrate flows through the nephron is from the glomerular capsule. It gets passed on to the proximal convoluted tubule, and then it goes to the nephron loop where sodium ions and water are absorbed and reabsorbed, and then it's passed on to the distal convoluted tubule. From the distal convoluted tubule, the filtrate moves to the collecting duct into a little region known as the papillary duct. From the papillary duct, it's passed on to the minor and major calyces that merge into the renal pelvis. The renal pelvis is a portion where all the calyces merge together and empty their filtrate, or now urine. The urine is passed on to the ureter, which are long pipes that connect to the bladder. And from the bladder, it's passed on or excreted out of the body through the urethra. The first function of the nephron is to be a part of glomerular filtration, which happens in the glomerulus. So the glomerulus consists of the glomerular capsule, which contains the glomerulus, and the glomerular filtrate collects in something called as the capsular space. So this area over here is called the capsular space, and from the capsular space it flows into the proximal convoluted tubule. Note that the vascular and urinary in the vascular and urinary poles right over here, the afferent arteriole is larger than the efferent arteriole, because when the blood enters the glomerular capsule, it enters under a lot of pressure, and when it exits out, it doesn't have so much pressure, because you need a lot more pressure for filtration and not so much pressure for removal of substances. So these, what are these called? Glomerular capillaries consist of podocytes or extensions known as podocyte in the capillary walls that we look at in just a second. So filtration in the glomerulus is a non-selective process. The only criteria for filtration is the size. These capillaries contain something called as fenestrations or pores. Through these pores, when blood pressure is really high, when blood pressure to the afferent arteriole drives the filtration, blood filters through these fenestrations and they are pushed across the capillaries. The filtration process results in separation of blood into the filtrate, which gets collected into the capsular space, and the remaining portion of blood goes on its way back into the efferent arteriole. So glomerular filtration happens through the fenestrated endothelium or the little pores, and these extensions that you see are known as the podocytes. So podocytes are the extensions, and these openings are known as the fenestrations. Now, The filtration membrane is the three-layer barrier through which the fluid passes, and this one is a non-selective process. So the first is the first is the fenestrated endothelium of the capillaries. So these are large pores which exclude blood cells. So if you see blood in the urine, there's a problem because blood cells do not pass through these fenestrations, but they are highly permeable to anything else in the blood. So a lot of water and a lot of solutes pass through these fenestrations, and then it goes through the basement membrane, and the basement membrane basically repels negative charge. So you shouldn't see too much albumin in the urine, and the larger molecules greater than 8 nanometer are excluded right at the basement membrane, and anything that has a negative charge gets excluded at this tip. And then the filtrate passes through the filtration slits known as the podocytes. So podocytes are cell extensions that wrap around the capillaries, and anything that is negatively charged cannot easily pass through these podocytes. Yeah, so right over here is a close-up artist rendition of the filtration membrane. It is a three-layer membrane. The first one is the fenestrated capillaries, which has fenestrations or pores, and then you have the basement membrane, and then you have the podocytes. So the blood is filtered by through these three layers, and the first layer, the fenestrations, is small enough, they're large enough to allow several different electrolytes, water molecules, glucose, amino acids, fatty acids, and everything to pass through. But blood cells, large plasma proteins, don't pass through these fenestrations. And this layer over here, basement membrane, helps this process because it helps in excluding large proteins like albumin. So it prevents the passage of albumin through these filtration layers. Most molecules that are greater than 8 nanometers in diameters are turned back, so they cannot pass through. And through the next filtration slits in the podocytes, water, electrolytes, glucose, amino acids, fatty acids, vitamins, urea, uric acid, and creatine, they pass through and they enter the capsular space. Okay. So the next step is tubular reabsorption. Tubular reabsorption happens in the proximal convoluted tubule of the nephron. So the proximal tubules are loaded with microvilli. Microvilli help in increasing the surface area for absorption. So in the proximal tubule, 65% of the filtrate gets reabsorbed. And that's why this process or this step is called tubular reabsorption. It removes some substances from the blood and then secretes it back into the tubular fluid for disposal in the urine. And it contains a bunch of microvilli which help in actively reabsorbing substances. And it contains a lot of mitochondria as well, because some of these processes require active transport for which we need ATP. So this region of the nephron contains a lot of mitochondria. And tubular reabsorption basically is a process of reclaiming water and solutes from the tubular fluid and returning them back to the bloodstream, just in case, because keep in mind that 99% of substances are filtered and the filtrate is really, really concentrated. So at this point, the nephron says, wait a minute, we might not need to throw away all of that. So it reclaims a lot of water and solutes from the tubular fluid and is reabsorbed back into the bloodstream. Now, the main thing that is absorbed in the proximal convoluted tubule is, well, basically sodium and water. Sodium reabsorption is the key because sodium helps in reabsorption of chloride, because chloride follows sodium and water follows sodium. So sodium ion is the most abundant cation in the filtrate, and the reabsorption of sodium creates a very sharp or very drastic concentration gradients that helps in osmotic helps in creation of an osmotic gradient for reabsorption of water. So tubular reabsorption is important because when sodium is reabsorbed, negative ions like chlorides are reabsorbed as well due to electrical attraction. Keep in mind, chloride follows sodium and water follows sodium. So when sodium is reabsorbed, chloride and water follow. So when chloride is reabsorbed, they help in creating an electrical gradient, and they activate certain pumps like sodium potassium pump. When they get activated, sodium, in exchange for 3 sodium ions taken into the cell, potassium ions is taken out. So other anions like K+ ions can be taken up along with chloride pumps by mechanisms of symport. So potassium sometimes follows sodium when necessary. Now, during tubular reabsorption, several other ions like potassium, magnesium, and phosphate ions diffuse through a paracellular route with water. And phosphate ions also co-transported into the epithelial cells with sodium ions. So you can see that sodium ion basically affects all other pumps. And some calcium is also reabsorbed in the process through paracellular route. Paracellular transport or the paracellular route is basically the type of transport wherein ions pass through the tissue fluid rather than passing from cell to cell. They pass through the tissue fluid and they get reabsorbed back into the capillary. So during tubular reabsorption, nitrogenous wastes are reabsorbed. Nephron reabsorb about half the urea in the tubular fluid. So the concentration of the remaining blood remains safe. And the proximal convoluted tubule reabsorb uric acid, but later in the portions of the nephron, like distal tubule, it's secreted back into the urine. Now, creatine is never reabsorbed in any process. It's just passed through the urine and excreted out of the body. So the next step is known as tubular secretion. Now, tubular secretion is the process wherein everything that's not wanted in the blood is again secreted back into the filtrate or the urine. So reabsorption and tubular secretion, they both occur to some extent in the distal convoluted tubule. And this stage mainly involves recovery of NaCl in water. So keep in mind, chloride and water follow sodium. And in this stage, bicarbonate ions are reabsorbed back into the bloodstream because bicarbonate ions are important for maintaining the pH of the blood. And in the distal convoluted tubule, excess hydrogen and sodium ions are removed from the bloodstream and secreted into the urine. And this is important again to maintain the pH of the body. So this picture shows basic stages of urine formation. The first one is glomerular filtration, wherein basically blood is filtered and it separates into the filtrate and really concentrated blood, which is taken away from the glomerulus through the efferent arteriole. The second stage is tubular reabsorption, wherein the useful solutes are taken back into the bloodstream. And then the third stage is tubular secretion, where additional waste like hydrogen ions and potassium ions are removed from the blood and added to the filtrate. And the last stage is water conservation. Now, water conservation involves hormones like antidiuretic hormone, and it mainly happens in the collecting duct. The collecting duct is controlled by antidiuretic hormone, and in the absence of ADH or antidiuretic hormone, water in the renal filtrate is allowed to enter urine. So it promotes removal of water from the body. And when ADH is present, aquaporins are activated, and aquaporins are channels that allow reabsorption of water. So they prevent excessive loss of water from the body. So ADH plays a very, very important role in conservation of water in the body. So keep in mind, when there's no ADH, water is allowed to enter the urine, so we get more dehydrated. And when ADH is present, aquaporins aid in reabsorption of water back in the bloodstream, so we get rehydrated. So tubular secretion is the last stage. It's mainly happens before maintaining acid-base balance, waste removal, and clearance of drug contaminants. Okay, so the acid-base balance is an important function of the kidney, and it is done by returning bicarbonate ions to the blood and by helping removal of excessive ions from the bloodstream. So there are several hormones that regulate the kidney function. First hormone is aldosterone. Second one is antidiuretic hormone, which we just talked about. And the last one is atrial natriuretic peptide. So the first hormone, that is aldosterone, is the salt-retaining hormone. And keep in mind, water follows sodium. So when the blood pressure falls, basically aldosterone is secreted, and aldosterone helps in retaining salt. So the main functions of aldosterone is to stimulate reabsorption of sodium, and in turn it helps in secretion of potassium back in the filtrate. When sodium is reabsorbed, chloride and water follow. And when water is reabsorbed, it increases the volume and the blood pressure. So increases the volume and in turn it may help in increasing blood pressure, but basically it helps in retaining salt. The main job of aldosterone is to maintain the blood volume and pressure, and since it helps in retaining sodium and indirectly helps in retaining water in the body, it makes urine more concentrated. So this picture over here shows a very important mechanism known as renin-angiotensin-aldosterone mechanism. So this mechanism is one of the main mechanisms that helps in controlling blood pressure and the filtration rate in the kidney. When the blood pressure in the body drops, in response to the low blood pressure, the baroreceptors get activated in the carotid artery and the aorta, and it stimulates the sympathetic nervous system. Now, the sympathetic nervous system triggers the release of something called as renin by the kidney. Now, this renin helps in synthesis of angiotensin II. Angiotensin II is a hormone that helps in secretion of aldosterone by the adrenal cortex. And in turn, aldosterone helps in sodium and water retention. It helps in increasing blood pressure. Now, angiotensin II is also a potent vasoconstrictor. So when angiotensin II is secreted, the blood vessels get constricted, and this helps in increasing blood pressure. And the third mechanism is the activation of the hypothalamus. So when angiotensin II is secreted, we feel really, really thirsty, and we drink a lot of water. And when we drink a lot of water, we help in increasing the blood pressure when needed, because we have enough water to increase the blood pressure. So the last hormone, which is very important in regulating, maintaining the function of the kidney, is natriuretic peptides. Now, natriuretic peptide has an opposite effect because it helps in inhibition of antidiuretic hormone. And the absence of antidiuretic hormone, excess water is allowed to enter the urine. So this promotes something called as diuresis. So it helps in loss of water from the body. And the other way natriuretic peptides affect blood pressure is by inhibiting reabsorption of sodium. And when sodium is reabsorption is inhibited, water reabsorption is inhibited by the collecting ducts as well. So the other function of natriuretic peptide is to dilate the afferent arteriole. When the arteriole gets dilated, and it constricts the efferent arteriole, so it increases the glomerular filtration rate. Okay. So osmoregulation is an important component of filtration in the kidney, and it is affected a lot by diuretics like ethyl alcohol and caffeine. So when people drink a lot of beer, what do? They line up in front of the restroom because they need to pee. It's because diuretics basically inhibit ADH release. When ADH release is inhibited, it promotes loss of water from the body. Similarly, caffeine is also a diuretic. It inhibits sodium transport back into the bloodstream. So when sodium reabsorption is inhibited, water is not recovered by the body. So you can see how one thing affects the other. Okay. So you can, from a clinical perspective, you probably know that the composition and properties of urine are very, very important. You go for a pregnancy test, they check your urine. You have a UTI, they check urine. Or you have a kidney infection, they're definitely going to check urine. So urinalysis is basically examination of the chemical and physical properties of urine. And normal urine varies from clear to deep amber color depending on how hydrated you are. You should not see any blood in the urine. And the color of urine is basically due to urochrome, which is a pigment formed as a result of breakdown of red blood cells. Now, if the urine is really cloudy, it may suggest that you're extremely dehydrated, or it may suggest the presence of bacteria. So it could suggest a urinary tract infection or trauma or kidney stones, or just a contamination with other fluids. So if you don't think you have UTI, the best way is to drink a lot of water, and in a little while urine starts to clear out as you get hydrated. Now, cloudiness in the urine can also cause pus in the urine or pyuria. And hematuria is basically presence of blood in the urine. This could be due to an internal infection or a trauma or the presence of kidney stones, etc. And the odor of the urine can change due to the presence of bacteria. Now, the bacteria in the urine degrade urea to ammonia, because of which you have the smell in the urine, the ammonia-like smell in the urine. So urine basically consists of ammonia, sulfate, phosphate, chloride, calcium, potassium, sodium, creatinine, uric acid, and urea, but it contains 95% of the urine. So this is just a shot of a urinalysis. It tells you the pH, protein. It tells you the presence of glucose, ketones, bilirubin, or occult blood is basically invisible blood that you don't really see in the urine. You shouldn't see any red blood cells or white blood cells in the urine. Now, white blood cells, the presence of white blood cell in the urine is a sign of infection. And casts are basically tube-shaped particulate matter in the urine that have been processed by the kidney. And some of the components that are tested for in the urine is maybe hyaline. So depending on the casts, depending on the types of casts, some like granular casts, we can tell what kind of disease a person might have. So that's a preliminary test, of course. But basically, keep in mind, casts are just tube-shaped particulate matter that you may find in urine. And depending on the types of particulate matter in the urine, we can determine whether a person has a kidney disease or a nephrotic shock or dehydration, etc. So these are some examples of casts in the urine. This over here, white blood cell in the urine, is a sign of kidney infection. And right over here, you see epithelial cells present in the urine may be a sign of rejection of kidney transplant. And then you have granular casts, which may be a sign of kidney disease. Or if you see fatty acids in the cast, it may be a sign of nephrotic shock, etc. Okay, so kidney stones, a first sign of kidney stone is backache, and it causes the presence of, it is caused due to the presence of excessive deposition of calcium in the kidney. This condition is known as hypercalcemia, which may be an indirect result of dehydration and pH imbalances in the body. So kidney stones are formed when some salts are not filtered properly, or they may not dissolve in the filtrate, which leads to the formation of certain salt crystals. And these salt crystals may form stones and they block urine. And over time, they can be very, very painful. So they can be treated by shockwave, something called as the shockwave lithotripsy, to break down or dissolve the stones. But the other methods also include dissolving drugs or surgery. Now, lithotripsy is a non-surgical technique that basically breaks down stone in the presence of ultrasound into smaller particles or powder. So the last portion of the urinary system is the ureter and the urethra. So the ureter is a tube that brings urine to the bladder, and the urethra is the opening that through which we excrete urine out of the body. Now, there are two muscles in the urethra. So this portion is the urethra. This is the internal urinary sphincter, and this is the external urinary sphincter. The internal urinary sphincter is a band of smooth muscle which is involuntary in nature, so it is not under our control, but the external urethral sphincter is under voluntary control. And the fact that this is under voluntary control is why we can hold our urine for a while, even if our bladder is full. So the male urethra not only excretes fluid but is also a part of the reproductive system. So rather than a straight tube found in the female body, the male urethra is an S-shaped tube, and it follows the line of the penis. So it's approximately 18 to 20 centimeters long, and it passes through three regions. It passes through the prostatic regions, and then it passes through the membranous region, and it passes through the penile urethra. That's right over here, that spans the corpus spongiosum of the penis. So this is the corpus spongiosum of the penis, and right over here is the external urethral orifice. So the prostatic portion itself is only about 2.5 centimeter long, and it passes along the neck of the urinary bladder through the prostate gland. This section is designed to accept drainage from tiny ducts within the prostate gland, and it has two ejaculatory ducts. So this is indirectly also used for draining the prostate gland. And the female bladder, on the other hand, is really, really short, and the female urethra is bound to the anterior vaginal wall. So the external opening of, let's go back to the other picture, the external opening of the urinary bladder is bound to the anterior vaginal wall, and in female it's approximately 4 centimeters long, and it leads out of the body through the urethral orifice. And because the urethra is so short in the females, they are more prone to urinary tract infections than males. So kidney can fail either due to ascending infection from the bladder up the ureter, or it can be a descending infection, like the bloodstream once infected can cause infection and failure of the kidney, or it can be caused due to prolonged use of common drugs and alcohol. Hypertension and diabetes can also cause kidney failure. So for treating high blood pressure, diuretic drugs are used, and when the kidney gets failed. And when in extreme cases, a person might have to take a kidney transplant, which is relatively common and it's really, really successful. And the second option is dialysis by using a dialysis machine. Now, in this, a person gets hooked to the dialysis machine and blood is filtered and it is put back into their body. This procedure is really time consuming. It takes 3 to 4 hours and it must be done at least 3 times a week in extreme cases. So this blood is filtered by machine and then it must be sent back into the body. So these are some important topics that we covered in the urinary system that you must know. Focus on the anatomy and everything on the PowerPoint that is written. So this will be a part of your final exam in a couple of weeks. So please pay attention to the lecture notes that have been provided to you. So with this, we have finished the main topics in the urinary system. I hope you watched the video.